Hello, everyone, and welcome in to part of our series talking to different members of our community about different issues. We've spoken with Tamika Isaac Devine on civic engagement. We've spoken with Rashonda Pratt on media relations. We've spoken to our law enforcement, and now, more importantly than ever, here we are turning to our faith leaders. And for those of you who are not familiar with me, my name is Crystal Fry. I am a woman's best friend. I'm a personal identity coach, and in that light, I specialize in transformation through communication, whether that's communication with yourself, whether it's communication with a spouse, a partner, relationships, whether it's communicating with God. All things transform through communication. And so it is my joy, my honor, my pleasure to have here with me today Pastor Jackie Utley of Ascension Lutheran Church. And so I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Jackie and let her provide an introduction of sorts. So Pastor Jackie, tell everyone what you would like them to know about you.
Okay, hello everyone. Crystal, it is so good. It's such an honor and a privilege to be your guest today, to share with everyone today. I myself kind of see myself as a catalyst in the movement of racial reconciliation, for the fact that my life's journey has been one of inclusivity, racial harmony, for the fact that as I am the pastor of the Ascension Lutheran Church, which at the time that I became the pastor back in 2013, it was a historical event to the fact that I was the first African American to be ordained in the Lutheran Church in the state of South Carolina. And then after that, to be called as pastor to Ascension Lutheran Church, where I now pastor, as the first African American and first female of this, at the time, predominantly white congregation. And so then I always tell people that once I became the member at this particular church, it was no longer a white congregation. It was a congregation of diversity. And so that's who we are. That's what we are. We're looking like what God's kingdom should look like. That we are a congregation of diversity, of racial diversity. And so it is a privilege to have Crystal in my life, attending the church and being a part of our spiritual journey. And so as she has asked me today to share some things, especially in light of what we're going through and the times that we're living through, I have much to share, and I am honored to just share something from my heart. I will be speaking from my heart today with all that I have to say.
And that is precisely why you were the one that I wanted to do this segment with, because I know from my own personal experience with you that you do speak from your heart, and you do have such a unique perspective. Not only being, a female pastor, but being an African American female pastor in what has traditionally been a predominantly white male religion, as far as leadership goes. So just your own personal life experience brings so much more to the story, to what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to go ahead and jump in. And so from your perspective, again, we are talking in reference in large part to a lot of the unrest that we have within our country right now. And while we'll be more focused, a little more focused kind of on the micro level, on our community level, I think that the things that we're going to talk about, they apply to a larger scale. So from your perspective, how have these most recent incidents of racial violence impacted the faith community?
Well, from my perspective, Crystal, I would begin by saying that in light of these recent incidents that have occurred, especially our viewing of George Floyd's death, it they have awakened the faith community to take a deep look within and to examine oneself individually, a soul searching, if you will. Like,
Absolutely.
what part do I play in the scheme of things, in this great, big, vast world, in this little community, this little faith community or whatever neighborhood that I'm in? How do I fit in and what part do I play? And so the faith community as a whole has been impacted by the need to take a closer look at what part the church should play in the scheme of things. As a matter of fact, I am a member of Interfaith Partners of South Carolina, and it is a diverse group of religions and ethnicities. And the president of the Interfaith Partners is a professor at a seminary, at a Presbyterian seminary. And he is a fine colleague of mine, and he shared something with me of recent. And he said that the president of the seminary asked all of the professors this question. And he said he was challenged by this question. And the question is, how will white Christians respond to all that has happened? And he said he is a white, male, privileged Christian. And he struggles with this question. And he said he has to ask this question of himself. And in asking himself that question, here's what he concluded. In his words, that the veil of ignorance has once again been exposed. He says Christianity is exposed. White Christians have been exposed. Those are his feelings. And that's what he's had to share with me. And so the two of us have gone back and forth sharing. He wants to hear from me, from my heart as an African American, and he knows the plight that I have dealt with because of some conversations that he and I have had. And so he invited me to share a piece with his. He wrote up a piece and I wrote a piece together, and the two of us, we have publicized it out among our colleagues of the Interfaith Partners of South Carolina. And I thought in answering that question from my perspective, that I would say that here's a white male that named what part white Christians should maybe, how would they respond? And so he can speak for his race as well as I can speak for mine, for the faith community as a whole. That's what I would say. And so it would be a matter of literally coming to grips with, what are we going to do as a faith community, regardless of our race? What are we going to do as a faith community?
And I think you're spot on with that, because while it is very easy to, as we consume news media, as we consume social media, it's very easy to look at things only from a worldview and let that be a dividing factor of, how the African American community responds, how the white community responds, and what that looks like. But that, again, is really one of the main reasons I wanted to make sure that we were keeping our faith community within this conversation, because just as you have expressed, it's not just how we're responding from a community standpoint, but from our faith. And, I agree wholeheartedly that this is a wake-up call on different levels.
Yes.
Not just me as a person, as an individual, or you as a person, as an individual, but how we view things from a spiritual perspective as well.
Absolutely.
And so I thank you for sharing that with us.
Yes, yes, Crystal, because to be honest with you, I was just thinking about yesterday's in our lectionary. One of our readings was the Genesis reading, and it was the story of the creation. And then when you look at God creating humanity in God's own image and God's likeness, race had nothing to do with anything at the time that God made the creation of humanity. And so that's what as a faith community, we should lean more toward the biblical principles of being one humanity and not to be divided by racial diversity.
And you know what, that actually leads very well into my next question, because we
Okay.
know that what is happening across the country and in our own communities, we're here in
Yeah.
Columbia, South Carolina, and
Mm-hmm.
we're geographically far away from the events in Minnesota, but yet even just several weeks ago we
Mm-hmm.
had peaceful protests that violence was brought into it, and
Yeah.
that stirs up some other feelings as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So with that, we know that what we're seeing is devastating. How do we reconcile what we are seeing with our faith?
Okay, I would say, keeping in mind with what my white male colleague had to say about white Christians, uh, having to examine what are we going to do as an African American regarding reconciliation, I would say it is high time that we as a faith community begin to recognize what is the initial problem, and race is at the core of it. And so as a faith community, when you ask the question, what can we do to reconcile? Well, before we begin the work of reconciliation, there are some things that we need to do. And first of all, we need to acknowledge from a faith perspective, because we live in a sin-broken world, racism first is a sin. And the faith community at first should recognize that it is a sin and there is need for repentance of all sin. And so therefore there is a need to repent for the sin of racism. There is the sin of indifferences, you see, and it's due to having an unconscious bias. Every one of us as human beings have our own biases. And it's an unconscious bias that we may not realize affects our way of thinking. But we know when people look different and do things differently from us,
Mhm.
we all fall back on our biases. And so those are the type of things that as a faith community, once we recognize and own up to, confess, and be honest and open about our unconscious biases that we may have that might affect the way we deal with people of other races or what have you, as Christians, because there's some Jesus loving, church going people who are racist, you see. And
Right.
until everyone in every faith community comes to the knowledge of saying, well, let me examine myself. Do I have some biases that would lead to me reacting, wrongfully towards someone who is racially diverse from me? And that's the starting point of trying to even think of doing any type of work of reconciliation. First, coming to grips with repenting for any part that any individual in any faith community would have to play. Because I mean, there are some people who would say, it's all white people that are the racists. Well, there's racism in all nationalities. African Americans, there are racist African Americans as well as there are whites and what other ethnicities. And so everybody just has to come clean and confess what part they play and repent of the sin of indifferences and racism.
You're right. It absolutely starts first with self,
Yes.
and being able to have that, that for some a more difficult conversation than others with yourself,
Yes.
and
Yes.
being in a place where you can be honest
Mm-hmm.
about, you're exactly right, we all come with our own unconscious biases because of our experiences, because of our history, where we come
Yes.
from, different places that we've lived, different experiences that we've had, from a life and a cultural perspective. And
That's
so I
right.
think that's exactly right. We first start with ourselves to
Mm-hmm.
examine, well, gosh, if nothing else, I hope that what is happening right now does just that. It
Yes.
allows people the notice that they need to say, hey,
Yes.
perhaps it's time to pause and take a look in and
Absolutely.
see,
Uh-huh.
is
Yes.
there anything? And if
Mm-hmm.
there is, you know,
Yeah.
we certainly can't operate um, moving forward from a
Yes.
place where we harbor any type of hate or any type of
Right.
racism in our hearts. And
That's right.
so,
That's
um,
right.
I was actually have been recently talking about love overcoming fear, and
Yes.
racism oftentimes starts, it's first, it's taught. It's not something that we are born with. It's something that
Yes.
we learn. And I
Right.
think that one of the big things that contributes to racism is fear.
That
Fear of the unknown.
that's at the core.
You
Fear
know,
is at the core.
you
Fear
don't
is at
look
the
like
core.
me, and so that makes me afraid. And so instead of having that mindset of, well, you don't look like me, let me get to know you. How are,
Yes.
and
Right.
celebrating the differences and the uniqueness. I
Yes.
think that for some it's an easier track to say, well, you don't look like me and that scares me and I'm afraid, so I don't like you.
That's right, because I'm afraid of you.
Yes,
I'm
yes.
afraid.
But,
Yes. Uh-huh.
thankfully we know that love wins no matter what.
That's right. Love wins every time. And I thank God for that. Yes. Yes, most
So
definitely.
as we
Hmm.
are as we're continuing our conversation and speaking specifically about, the fact that, and Pastor Jackie, you and I have been around each other for several years now,
Yes.
and we
Uh-huh.
don't look anything alike. We are
Nope.
both female, but we don't share any other, many other physical attributes that are the same. However, when I look at you, I see a fantastic, phenomenal, beautiful woman who leads me in my faith.
I
And
think.
that is what draws me in. And
Thank you,
so
Crystal.
as we
Uh-huh.
are continuing to move forward
Hmm.
and wanting to see progress happen, what are the conversations that we need to be having with our brothers and sisters who don't look like us?
When you mention conversations, Crystal, there's here once again, there's a first step to be taken because first of all, there's a need to educate oneself about the other. There's just some things that you maybe have never considered about the other, the person that's different from you. And so there's just things that when you don't know a thing, you don't know a thing. When you don't know, you just don't know.
You don't know
And
what
so
you don't
you don't know what you don't know. You could easily say the wrong thing. You can easily offend. And I find that most times we might as well just face the fact that it's a known fact. It's just this way. It's always said that white people don't like to talk about racism or race because it's uncomfortable. If there's a race that's superior to another race that would be the inferior, well, if you got to talk about the power that I have over you, then I'm uncomfortable if it makes me look like I'm the bad guy or the bad person and everything. And so, first of all, there's a need for some education, educating people about how to talk about race. And like I said earlier, I am a member of the Interfaith Partners of South Carolina, and I said it's a racially diverse group of us. Then I am a member of the Women of Many Faiths, and I am one of a few African American sisters that are part of this group of women, and we come together. And so we do a lot of sharing, and we have a lot of conversations among ourselves in these two particular groups that I just mentioned. However, just of recent, we had a virtual meeting with both these groups, and white female shared how they were getting ready to do a book study, and the title of the book is How to Be an Anti-Racist. How to Be an Anti-Racist. Well, I would say coincidentally, but it's not coincidental. I get a letter a day before this woman shares this with me that the dean of the Lutheran seminary across the street from the church, that they're conducting that same book study with that same book. How not to be, how to
Yeah.
be an anti-racist. And so they're going to lift that up in their community. And so right now, what I'm seeing, I'm hearing this from the white Christians that they're saying, let's look at this. And anybody, I'm sure, like I said before, with African Americans, with racism being in our race as well, anybody I would think could benefit from this particular type of book study. And just like I was saying earlier, African Americans have racism too in our community. And so I'll be the first to say that there's some education that is needed on both our parts, both races. Because I know I have Latino friends and colleagues, and they'll say, how come we get left out of this conversation about race? And sometimes it's as if we don't exist, and we're a minority too, and why don't, and I said, well, when we think about the history between blacks and whites here in America and the 400 years of slavery, it's a black and white issue. Bottom line, we're not excluding all other minorities, you know, the Asians, the Latinos, or what have you. But when it comes right down to it, it's about some reconciliation that is needed to take place with whites and African Americans. And so when I think about these conversations that you're asking of, Crystal, first of all, I'm proud to say that, like I said earlier in my introduction, I've always been involved with racial reconciliation work. And so here in the Lutheran Church, not just statewide, but nationally, we often hold workshops that will be targeted toward racial conversations and reconciliation and such. And so nationally and statewide, we've conducted a workshop called Talking Together, Facing Racism in Our Communities. And just to give you one example of when you're in that workshop, we build a system of trust in the people that are going to participate in the workshop, and we make sure that it's diverse, both genders, and it's racially diverse and what have you. And like, say for instance, one of the first questions that might be asked in that workshop would be, how would you introduce yourself ethnically? You know, racially, how do you refer to yourself? And so there are some, like, from an African American perspective, I personally like being called a Black woman. That's who I am. So I introduce myself as a Black woman. I don't associate that well with African American. It's just a political correctness of referring to people of color as an African American. And I always say, I'm so far removed, my ancestry is so far removed from Africa until I'm a Black American. And so I will introduce myself as a Black woman. I'm in the room sitting next to another Black female, and she prefers to be called an African American lady or an African American, you know, woman or what have you, or female. And so there's the difference right there. So you have two white people in the room, and one says, well, I like to be referred to as a Caucasian, or I like to be referred to as a WASP, you know. And so once you begin to hear people share, you're only being honest. So it starts with honesty and just saying, this is who I am in the skin that I'm in. And this is this is how I see myself. This is how I introduce myself. And so in that particular workshop, we end up getting down to the nitty gritty of how each individual deals with racial diversity. And it's been very productive. And in addition to that, in our Lutheran church, we have, where both whites and Blacks will view movies together. We'll sit and we'll watch movies like Selma, Remember the Titans, The Hate U Give is a movie that we've watched. And so we watch them together in a diverse group. And then after the movie, with all that's invoked in those movies, those racial tensioned movies, then we sit and have a conversation. And usually it's over a meal. We have some food or what have you, breaking bread together. And then we have discussions. And then they're painful discussions, because in these movies, you see some suffering and some pain. And so, and then, yes, in these movies, you see the African American as the victim in the movie. And so then you have whites looking at these movies and then beginning to feel the pain that was inflicted upon their African American brother or sister. And so then when they turn to one another and begin to have conversation, they have something to build off. They have something to relate to. And it's like, I feel your pain. The African American begins to speak their pain, and the white American begins to say, I feel your pain like I've never before. Then in addition to these projects, we also have book studies. And right now we're conducting a book study from a book called Trouble I've Seen, How Changing the Way the Church Views Racism. And I think I just lost my picture with, lost my audio there, Crystal, with my computer acting up. But this book study, we're in the midst of this book study now, and there's several white colleagues, Christian friends of mine, that because of this book study, after they've just witnessed these racial incidents that have occurred, I have heard from several of them, and they're saying, I am in a better place understanding and dealing with what's going on around us now, just from having the conversations that we've had in this book study. Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church deals with racism and everything. So those are just a few examples of projects that we must begin to look at so that we can have these conversations. And they can be done in every congregation, in every faith community.
And Pastor Jackie, I think that is exactly, you're spot on with that. And those are exactly the kind of conversations that need to be happening in individual congregations to promote racial healing, to promote justice, to make sure that we're seeing, again, like you mentioned earlier, we're definitely in a time where there are more eyes being opened, I believe, ever before. And for whatever reason, I won't speculate. I won't speculate as to why there are now more eyes being opened. Only to the fact that I'm grateful that there are, because it has opened the door. Outside of some of the negative things that we've seen on the news and through social media, we all know that we don't get the whole story. We don't. There are always more. There's always more than one side to the story.
Absolutely.
We don't get the whole thing. So I think it's so important that we're having these conversations in individual congregations, because that communication is where we can start to heal. And
like you said, transformation through communication. I like that. I like that you have that title.
Because we first have to, we have to have the conversation to be able to really understand what the other party, how they see, how they feel, what their experience is.
Absolutely.
And for a lot of white Americans, they don't have a good grasp or an understanding what their African American counterpart goes through.
What do we say? When you don't know a thing, you don't know it. When you don't know, you just don't know.
And you don't know what
you don't know. That's why I would like my friend before, when he said the veil of ignorance has, and I hate to use the term ignorance, but when you don't know a thing, you don't know a thing. And that's why you can say the wrong thing sometimes. And I've always run into white peers that will say, I get nervous sometimes talking to some African Americans or some black people. I don't even know what to call you. I don't know whether you want to be called black or whether you want to be called Negro or whether you want to be called African American. And I'll put my foot in my mouth and I don't mean any harm. And it happens. It does happen all the time. And what I can say most of all about what I am getting from all that's taking place now is that so far over the past couple of weeks, when the Ahmaud Arbery murder took place and Breonna Taylor, as these things began to happen and the world is seeing it, and it just took this George Floyd killing to open the eyes of America, it seems. I must say that for the first time in my life, having been born and raised through the segregated 60s, early 60s, and going through the colored fountain and the white fountain. I've lived that. So I've lived segregation, and then I've experienced integration. painful side of it and then a harmonious side of it. And I must say that when I look back at Dr. King's marches from way back in the 60s, and it was all these blacks marching, there'd be a few whites in there scattered about, marching for justice as well. And that was then. In this time, after what has happened here recently, when I turn on my TV and I see the peaceful protests, not the violent ones, and I see the peaceful protests, I tell you, Crystal, whites are outnumbering the blacks in this march for justice. And so finally, America's eyes have opened and said, okay, now I get it. When they say Black Lives Matter, whereas before I thought they were discrediting my white life or any other nationality's life, they're meaning that as Black people, we've been suffering at the hands of police brutality. So the movement was started, Black Lives Matter, to say, stop killing the Black men, give them a chance sometime, lock them up, don't kill them, you know. And so that's what the protest is all about. It's always been that Black Lives Matter. And so I've got white people carrying these signs all over the world, not just America, but all over the world. And so they get it now. And it blesses my heart to see all the races coming together to say, this is something that we want to change. That's where we're headed.
You're exactly right. It has become a global movement.
Mm-hmm.
There have been
Yes.
protests in New
Yes.
Zealand. There have been protests in Ireland. You know, there have been
Yes.
protests in places all over the world. And
Yes.
so it does very much seem like for the first time in a very long time. And I will be the first to admit I am not nearly as educated as I should be on the timeline of the
Yes.
civil rights movement. But
Yes.
I don't recall there being a global movement at that time.
Never
And
has been.
so for that to be happening now, and I know partly we can thank social media and the news media because you can now see things from different parts of the world, you know, instantly on your smartphone. But I believe that just adds and gives this even more power, even more, you know, it puts more push behind being able to get change that results in equality and equity. You know, because there are great demonstration of the difference between equality and equity. And I think that, again, an educational point, I think some people don't understand when you say, well, you know, well, everything's equal. There's equal opportunity. Yes, but we're not starting from the same place.
Absolutely, Crystal.
Equity comes in. So, and again, it's all an education place, and we will get there at some point. I feel
we're going to get there.
We're going to get there.
We're going to get there.
It's through these conversations, you know, these conversations that people are having now. It's one of the reasons why I believe this was laid on my heart to do this series of conversations, is because we as human beings, we need to be educated on each other, by each other.
Absolutely.
As a white woman, I can sit down and I can watch every movie about the civil rights movement. I can watch Selma. I can watch every movie. I can listen to podcasts. I can, you know, try to educate myself. I can read books. I can do all of those things. And those are all very good things. But those don't take the place of me sitting down and having a conversation with one of my African American sisters or brothers. And that is one of the things that I personally have been doing. I've been reaching out to those that I know, that I'm close with, and who know my heart and know that, listen, if I ever say anything to you, you know, please, by all means, say, you know what, Crystal, that's not quite, you know, educate.
That's right. Open and honesty.
Educate me for that, because I love you and I don't want to offend you. So if I do, tell me so that I don't do it again.
Absolutely.
So, you know, but it's had those conversations are what those are happening now. And
That's right.
that is one of the things I think that warms up my heart more than anything else, more than the awareness, is that
Yeah.
there is now action coming from the awareness as well, and having those
Yes.
conversations and
Yes.
understanding how can we affect change. And so I
Absolutely.
think it is wonderful to see. I mean, just
Yeah.
really, 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 as we're moving forward. And I want to
Yes.
make sure that my wish coming out of all of this is that we don't stop,
Absolutely. No.
that
Yeah. There's no stopping us now, I believe, Crystal.
that's
We're on our way. I believe
right.
that.
I just,
And as a woman of faith, anyway, I know that God is at the helm. And so we're just, if our will lines up with God's will, then we're going to get there. We will get there. Yeah.
absolutely. Well,
Mhm.
I'm going to ask you another question before we wrap up. Um,
Mhm.
how can we best support our faith leaders right now? As individuals, as congregations, as people of faith, how can we best support our faith leaders right now?
Well, Crystal, to be honest with you, I would say that one of the first things that faith leaders would need is prayer. That pray for one another, pray for each other, pray for the leaders, that they will be led by the Holy Spirit. That as leaders, that we will hear the voice of God and walk by faith and not by sight, but that we will pray that first. Because see, when I was growing up, I've always heard that if the head is wounded, then so is the whole body. If you got a headache, nothing else is functioning well on the rest of the body. So if the head is wounded, then so will the body be. And so when we look at leadership, faith leaders, we look at a congregation and we call it a family, a faith community, and we call ourselves a church family. And so we're in this one big family together. And then you have your faith leader, who is like the leader of the pack. And then when we look at that, we always consider how, if that's the case, we're looking to the leader for guidance. And so, because we're only human and we can make mistakes, pray for the faith leaders, that each of us, black, white, no matter what our race, that we'll have an open mind. And bottom line is that we must pray that God touches and changes every heart, because it's a heart condition that comes to wanting to reconcile and to do justice. It starts in the heart and not just. And I think my battery's getting low on my thing, because I think I'm breaking up on Crystal. But
Pastor Jackie, thank you so very much. It has been an honor and my blessing to have you here with us to talk about how we can support our faith leaders, how we move forward, how we walk down the path to racial reconciliation. And so
yeah.
I want to thank you for being here with me, for having this conversation, and then just turn over to you and see if you have any final thoughts that you want to share with our audience. Any final parting thoughts?
Thank you so much for having me, Crystal. This was an honor. I enjoyed it to be sharing this time with you too. In closing thoughts, I always like to make reference to, as a faith community, how the late Dr. Martin Luther King said, the most segregated hour of the week is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. And so there's that division in our faith communities when it's an all white congregation or an all black congregation. And so I see us as living out Dr. King's dream, where he would say that we'd all come together, black and white together, hand in hand. And we're living that dream because we worship together. In spite of racial diversity, we worship together in racial harmony, I would say. And so while our work is cut out for us in fighting this fight of injustice and to fight for equality and come against exclusivity. And so what I'd like to do, my closing thoughts, would be a quote from the late Dr. Martin Luther King. And this is that quote that I'd like to share with you, closing, Crystal. And it reads, "We have before us the glorious opportunity to inject a new dimension of love into the veins of our civilization. That is the beginning of racial healing.
I would have to agree with you 1000%. And that is a quote that I have not heard. So when we wrap up here, I will go and find that, because that speaks very much to what I do outside of what we're doing here.
Yes.
I have such a focus on love and that love that starts with self. If you want to change people, if you want to change things, the first thing that must change is you. You have to look within yourself and see what changes. We see that a lot in relationships. Well, he's not doing this or she's not doing that. Well, what are you not doing?
That's right.
And perhaps
look at self first.
Yes.
Self.
And so I love that quote that you just shared. That's an instant love for me right now. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. And for our audience who is joining us, I want to thank you for being here, for sharing your time with us, for listening, for adding in your thoughts and your opinions. Conversation must continue. And I believe that that is one of the most important things that we're doing here, is continuing the conversation, not having it once and then not having it again, but having it and continuing to have it and continuing to have it, so that we can see progress, we can see change. So for those of you who are new to me, my name is Crystal Fry, and I am a woman's best friend, teaching women to see themselves, to love themselves, and to transform into themselves, into the women that they were created to be. As a personal identity coach, transformation starts through communication. Transformation through communication, and that's what we're doing here tonight. So thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful night.